we're here to to celebrate our medievalist grad students. This spring, I know that there's been a lot of people affiliated with MSO in different departments. Myself and Noah from history, our Vice President Maddie from art history, and our second speaker today, Sonia, is a doctoral student in art history. And Jake Moore is a master's student in the English department. So we hopefully have a good collection of interdisciplinary papers to read through for you here. The way that we'll proceed with this, we'll start with Jake, Sonia will be second, and then Noah will be third, and then we'll just do a combined Q&A. And bringing us home is a master's student in history, Noah Cole. He has just recently defended his master's thesis on St. Bernardino of Siena and the observant movement. Noah is primarily interested in the ways in which learned culture, intellectual thought, and institutional movements may have come together to impact the lives of everyday people. He is especially interested in the intersections of religion, power, philosophy, and culture, and his future research focuses on medieval preaching humanism and moral reform. Noah, take it away.
Yes, thank you. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint because I hope to present this paper at a conference. And I do want to let those of you with cameras on at the moment that I'm going to record this for my grandparents. So if you don't want my grandparents to see what you look like, you should turn your camera off. So let's see, recording. All right, here we go. This paper analyzes Bernardino's Sermon 44 against worldly vanities and ostentation, or Contra Mundanas Vanitates et Pompis. In this sermon, the Franciscan preacher Bernardino inveighs against the worldly fineries of his contemporaries, the vanities, paying special attention to the specific faults of women who wore items too fine for their station and too fine for the world itself. Unlike other studies, I am using Bernardino's sermon to explore his conception of the body and its role in the construction of good and bad behavior, and by extension, good and bad people. Bernardino, in his campaign to rid the world of luxurious living and expensive clothes, brought the body to the forefront of the discussion. Using Bernardino's sermon, we can move beyond the discursive and examine how the very physicality of the body featured in religious texts. Previous studies have emphasized the role of sumptuary laws as a site of negotiation over social power and cohesion. Scholars have discussed luxury in the context of an ongoing anxiety over gender roles, modesty, and proper behavior. This study, though, shows that in addition to such concerns, the body itself was, for Bernardino at least, at the center of many of these problems. That Bernardino did not simply use bodily language as a rhetorical flourish suggests that others, perhaps those who continue to engage in luxurious living, might have also had a more corporeal understanding of luxury in society than previously thought. When we read that elites passed sumptuary laws that exempted important family members, we should be mindful that this choice could have been a bodily decision. That is, traditional explanations say that luxury conferred honor and status on the family of the wearer, and that elites exempted family members when they could for this reason. While this is certainly correct, it could also be that elites sought to continue to wear luxury and live luxuriously because it simply felt good. As we will see Bernardino write, elites might have literally blushed at the thought of putting away their sumptuous living. In the beginning of the sermon, Bernardino invites his readers to consider the fundamental dichotomy between good and evil in the world. Quote, "Just as we are called and invited by the heavens to love God, thus also by those of hell we are urged on to love the world. The spirit, out of a natural desire, reaches for higher things, while the flesh is dragged towards lower things." Now, this could be read as a simple world-heaven distinction, with flesh here being a colorful flourish to distinguish it from the incorporeal space beyond the world. However, following this statement, Bernardino goes on to express his concern for actual bodies occupying the sensual world. He writes that, quote, "The flesh drags the flesh towards bodily things." And in contrast, the spirit directs the mind towards heavenly things. That the body, flesh, or carnal thing is literally dragged towards things like it, while the mind is merely directed or seized, should not be ignored. Both certainly convey a level of coercion or even violence, but Bernardino's emphasis rests on the body being coerced. At the outset, then, Bernardino reveals that his priority will be on the carnal, exterior body that interacts with the world. Next, we will see Bernardino focusing on the poor, the rich, and the vanities. The body being drawn to material things of this world had real ramifications for the poor. In a section devoted to the history of the vanities, Bernardino calls upon faithful confessors, true preachers, and even the vain sinner to consider where luxury ultimately comes from. Quote, let them investigate whether or not these types of clothing and expensive ornaments are from illegally gotten riches, from the blood of the poor, or also by wicked agreements, seizure, usury, theft, simony, and other similar evils. Additionally, he quoted Luke 16:19, which relates the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man disdains the sore-infested Lazarus and refuses him charity. Bernardino quotes part of the scripture, quote, he was dressed in purple. He then inserts his own comment that the purple clothes of the rich man are, quote, often dyed with blood, since it was made by the blood of the poor and by impious avarice. Interestingly, Bernardino is careful not to simply exhort these sinners to get rid of all their possessions, containing the blood of the poor or not. Although he has been described as downright giddy when it came to burning luxurious goods, called bonfires of the vanities, he is more careful here. He wrote, for no one, unless they have committed grave offense, should simply throw 2 or 4 or 8 or 12 expensive fabrics into the fire, even though it is their own property. Since they are useful and suitable in a certain way and at certain times necessary for human life, and since there are many poor and needy for whom such a cloth or its economic value is needed. This indicates Bernardino was truly concerned with how the rich, in the act of simply having a wealth of resources, harmed the poor. He counseled them to think about how they could redirect their ill-gotten goods or money to good ends. Specifically, he points out how their goods and wealth could help the bodily needs of the poor. Bernardino moved from here to show how these material goods impacted the body. He wrote about the long trains that aristocratic women wore, sometimes trailing behind them for several yards. These trains were direct expressions of family, wealth, power, and prestige. Bernardino had little patience for this. So far as he was concerned, these trains brought nothing less than the devil himself into Italy. Bernardino asked derisively, quote, is there now not even one base woman who does not blush if she goes out without a train? With what we have seen already, we should take Bernardino's use of erubescat, or grows red, or to blush, as not just colorful language merely expressing embarrassment, but as a specific comment on the women having a bodily reaction to being without their vanities. Indeed, in an incredible explanation, he asks a bit later in the sermon, for what are these newfangled things, curious inventions and vanities, but a kind of carnal evisceration or vomit, and an affection for worldly things which grows in these corrupt times within people? For those who were good and had their intentions aimed towards the heavens, the vanities were vomit and bile. It was literal revulsion. Their vain compatriots walked around as if eviscerated and disemboweled, or eviscratio. As before, though, we should temper our instinct to regard such colorful language as merely evocative. For Bernardino, it seems that the vanities literally appeared as the vomit of the flesh, as disembowelment, and that these ornaments and vanities were working in this way on the body. Like any good preacher in the Middle Ages, Bernardino could not just point out flaws in sin. He needed to push his readers to consider the final result of sin, damnation. Bernardino explicitly connects worldly vanity and its material expression with bodily harm and destruction upon death. He compares the great and all their worldly finery to the ignoble and disgusting end they could expect as a result of their sins. Quote, consider that person who shone with glory in his palace yesterday, today, having been corrupted, falls into a tomb. And he who yesterday consumed so many luxuries at home, today is devoured by worms in a grave. The sinner's body will be damaged and consumed on account of its bodily mistakes from the world above. Bernardino quotes a portion of Moses' prayer from Psalms chapter 90, verse 5 through 6, which reads, quote, they are like the new grass of the morning, though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. Bernardino expands on this and enjoins the sinner to consider the bodily pain that awaits them. Dipping in and out of scripture, Bernardino writes, but consider what follows after the final stage of old age. In the evening, as in lifeless old age, it falls, namely by means of death. It is to the depths that it falls, into the infernal pit. The mind, grown old in vanities, will harden the body into a corpse, and will wither, ariscat, into dust, or will harden, namely the spirit, by means of eternal torment. and it will dry by means of the fire of hell and eternal punishment. Most English editions translate eriscat as will wither, extending the grass analogy. However, in this context, with Bernardino's interspersal of the scriptural passage into a new context, introduces the sense of eriscat as will dry, e.g., will dry by means of the fire of hell. One gets an image of the body flaking and splitting due to this eternal roast. Carolyn Walker Bynum has shown that in the early Middle Ages, quote, heaven was that realm of gold, gems, and crystal, whereas hell was the place of digestion and excretion, process, metamorphosis, and fluids. Earlier, we saw Bernardino working with themes of digestions and fluids with the vomit of the flesh. Perhaps we see also the fires of hell working with the later medieval concerns over death, purgatory, and the punishments of hell. Regardless, the key for Bernardino was the resulting bodily torture that awaited the sinner who enjoyed the bodily luxuries of his own day. In the second to last chapter of the sermon, Bernardino gives us a fitting apostrophe to the sinners he has been writing about. This exclamation fully encapsulates Bernardino's concern about the physical body and the influence the vanities have on it. O luxurious flesh of refined men and women, O soul nurtured in such lasciviousness, think of the deathbed that waits for you, although you never think of it, where the shade of death, where no order, but rather everlasting horror dwells, just as Job chapter 10, verse 22 attests, where undifferentiated vileness will be paid out in retribution for celebrated magnificence, where unending punishment will be allotted in retribution for unrestrained luxuries, and where, for the accumulation of piles of riches, they shall be delivered into insatiable want. As Isaiah chapter 14:11 writes, your superabundance or riches has pulled you to hell, your corpse cut to pieces. Underneath you, maggots spread and worms cover you. O delicata caro deliciosi viri et mulieris, or O luxurious flesh of refined men and women, is truly Bernardino at his best. Deliciosi certainly means delicate, luxurious, or refined. However, we should not miss the obvious potential here of a more body-centric translation. Quote, "Oh, that tender flesh of delicious men and women." Luxurious goods were eagerly awaited by the bonfires that Bernardino himself threw in his own day, and by the fires of hell as well. Only there, the sinner's tender flesh was cooked, and the person who lived the refined life would be consumed, as their gambling boards, fine linens, and expensive items ought to have been consumed in a bonfire while they were yet living. This paper complicates prevailing assumptions of what was at stake when medieval people meditated on the vanities in fine living. Using Bernardino's sermon, we can move beyond the discursive and examine how the very physicality of the body featured in religious texts. Previous studies have emphasized the role of sumptuary law as a site of negotiation over social power and cohesion. Luxury has been seen as part of an ongoing anxiety over gender roles, modesty, and proper behavior. This study, though, shows that in addition to such concerns, the body itself for Bernardino was at the center of many of these problems. Bernardino did not simply use bodily language as a rhetorical flourish, and this suggests that others, perhaps especially those who continue to engage in such sumptuous lifestyles, might have had a more corporeal understanding of luxury than we have previously appreciated. When we read that elites passed sumptuary laws that exempted important family members, we should be mindful that this choice really could have been bodily. Wearing and consuming luxury might have been experienced in sensory ways that we have not been appreciated. Sumptuary laws which restricted fine dress was often resisted because to obey would be to decrease the prominence and standing of one's family. But it is also likely, as we have seen, that men and women resisted curbing these vices because they remembered how good it felt to wear fine linen in public or to eat exquisite foods. As Bernardino wrote, they might have literally blushed at the thought of putting away their sumptuous living. The sensual world then, was truly one of flesh, body, and feelings, as much as it was one of materials, thoughts, and negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. All right, so looks like we're right at 6 o'clock, so we've got about a half an hour for questions. So I will, I or Maddie, if you see somebody that I don't, feel free to call on them. We'll try to call on people as we can. It's hard sometimes with Zoom to see everybody, so if there's sort of a lull where no one's talking and you have a question, feel free to just ask it. So sorry in advance if we miss a couple people, but we'll try to get as many as we can. So anybody has questions? Matt, you jumped right up, so go for
it. Thank you all for these great talks. I think these are all really really interesting. I learned a lot today. Noah, I have to ask you about food now, and I think you know this is coming. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your interpretation of this sumptuousness and sort of like the cooking aspect of the sinners' bodies as related to the separation, or how that relates sort of with the separation of like pure asceticism and like the rejection of all sort of bodily things, and how that potentially could relate to like hell mouths and like the consumption of sinners in like an actual food way. Is that something that you have seen, or am I just sort of grasping at straws a little bit?
It's not something I've looked at directly beyond a lot of the things that Carolyn Walker Bynum has written about, right? The food aspect is not something that I've looked at to a great degree. I know that she talks about it in a few of her books, of course, but I do think at least what little I can say from Bernardino's perspective is he's part of something called the Observant Movement, which is something I explore in my thesis. And they were very heavy on the ascetic life, simple foods, if you're even going to eat at all, right? And the idea that mortification of the flesh was efficacious for your soul, right? And so Bernardino, I think, here is really speaking to an audience that is fundamentally antithetical to everything he believes. And so I think that's why, to sort of answer your question, I don't really define what the vanities are in this paper, nor do I in the thesis, because similar to kind of what Jake was saying about medieval magic, the vanities in my case is just anything luxurious is the vanities. It's vain, right? If it's vain, it's the vanities. It's just the noun, basically, right? So I think in that sense, there's a lot of room to look into the food production aspect. But since the vanities are so hard to define, I haven't come across a lot of literature that is vanities and food. Most of the research is about law, because sumptuary law is a lot more straightforward to study, right? Because it obviously is blatantly sexist, right? So you can study that and see how it affects women and say a lot about culture and gender that way. Does that answer it at all?
No, yeah, I think that was really good. I'm just curious, and I think I might reach out to you afterwards and sort of see if there's something that I can pull from. I just want to read your paper because a lot of it was going over my head.
Yeah, for what it's worth, you sent me Wolgar's work on food, and I cite it in it, so you'll see that at the end. So.
Thanks for the question.
Sure. And Noah, I think you had a question in the comments as well, if you want to.
I would love to answer John's question. That's why I'm calling him that. That's my father. But I get to call him John because we're in a formal setting. So he asked about the sermon, how would it have been delivered, that type of thing. So the sermon that I talk about in my paper is what's called a Latin sermon. So it's written in Latin. But what that means is, Mr. Cole, what that means is it's not delivered to an audience. The sermons are part of a collection known as a sermon cycle that are kind of like a preaching manual, right? So when Bernardino wrote these sermons down, he was already pretty much everybody was in agreement that he was a saint. Everybody had decided that that was definitely a thing, and that he was one of the most, if not the most popular preacher in Italy at the time. This is the 15th century. So he wrote these sermons as training manuals for other preachers. And we know that, one, they still exist, which means people cared about them generally. That's a safe bet. And they were copied many times and eventually printed when the printing press made its way into Italy. And the next major saint in Italy, Giovanni of Capistrano, intentionally used these model sermons when he was young. when he was still too nervous to make his own sermons. But what we do know is preachers preached in the language of the vernacular, right? So the language that people actually spoke every day. And they generally recorded their thoughts in Latin so that it could be accessible to all churchmen in Europe, because everybody who was educated enough could read Latin. And so oftentimes preachers would have these manuals called Vaticums, I think that's how you say that. And it would just be a collection of Latin sketches, sometimes in the vernacular. Increasingly later, people just start writing in Italian. They would just translate on the fly sometimes. They would just read the Latin and translate into the vernacular as they went, or they would memorize beforehand. Yeah, so there's kind of a double nature there, I suppose.
Sure, Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I hadn't realized when I was looking at the picture of John Cole there that he was your father. No,
clothing and jewelry. I know this is always like a concern for the clergy to be worried about people wearing ostentatious things, but did he look at them at all? Do you know?
He was extremely well read on the early fathers. In this sermon in particular, he actually doesn't use a lot of the church fathers, aside from Augustine, because of course. In other sermons, he uses them considerably more. For instance, his sermon on charity, he uses, I always pronounce his name wrong, Chrysostom? Is that how you just said it, but Chrysostom? There we go. He uses him a lot, actually, to emphasize that you should give charity indiscriminately, which is a bit of a departure, because normally you should discriminate and give only to the worthy and that type of thing. But in this sermon in particular, he relies almost wholly on Scripture. And the last thing I'll say about it is he is an observant, part of the observant movement, which means all of them, to a man, were enamored with the early fathers, right? Because they wanted to return to the glory of the olden days of the church of the 13th century and then late antiquity. That was really the focus. But not in this sermon. He's mostly just using Scripture and yelling. That's really all he's doing in this sermon.
And that pretty much got us to 6:30. Do we have any lingering questions that anybody needs to get off? Speak now, forever hold your peace.
I just wanted to repeat again what a pleasure it was to see these papers, and thank you so much.
So we'll do some Zoom rounds of applause for our speakers here, and thank you all for coming. This was a great turnout. If you are active on Facebook, MSO is on Facebook. Feel free to toss us a like. We post infrequently, but when we do, it's always with events like this, so it's worth seeing. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you to our speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.